There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition. It lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Dimensions, a Twilight Zone podcast. I'm your host, Bill Couch, and on tonight's episode, we will be discussing Season 1, Episode 17, titled The Fever. This was written by Rod Serling, directed by Robert Flory, produced by Buck Houghton, musical score by Bernard Herrmann, and in the cast were Everett Sloan and Vivi Janis. The air date was January 29th of 1960, and you can watch this episode on Paramount Plus, Pluto TV, or the DVDs or the Blu-rays if you have them. And if you don't have them, I recommend making a purchase. It's if you're a fan of the show, you certainly can't go wrong with that. Now, fair warning ahead, there will be spoilers, there will be trivia, there will be a lot of things. We're going to discuss the episode, so if you haven't seen it yet, stop this podcast, go watch the episode, come back and listen to it. And as always, I welcome any and all feedback you might have for me. You can reach me at dimensionszpodcast@gmail.com, and I look forward to hearing from you about what you think about this episode, past episodes, or future episodes. So if you have anything you want to say, criticism, or congratulations, feel free to drop me a line. I love to hear from people. So without much further ado, here is me with the opening narration. Take it away, me. Mr. and Mrs. Franklin Gibbs, 3 days and 2 nights, all expenses paid, in a Las Vegas hotel. One by virtue of Mrs. Gibbs' knack with a phrase. But unbeknownst to either Mr. or Mrs. Gibbs is the fact that there's a prize in their package, neither expected nor bargained for. In just a moment, one of them will succumb to an illness worse than any virus can produce. A most inoperative, deadly, life-shattering affliction known as the fever. All right, thank you, me. So this episode starts with Mr. and Mrs. Gibbs, Franklin and Flora, as they are known, arriving at or being in their hotel/casino where Mrs. Gibbs wins a free 3-day, 2-night vacation, all expenses paid, and the hotel manager, whoever greets them, actually says they actually have unlimited credit, which means if they run out of money, they can sign for markers to get more money as a loan, basically, from the casino. But they have unlimited credit, so, nice way of the casino hotel saying that they want all your money, which is basically their business, and that's what they're in business for. Anyone that thinks otherwise is delusional. But I digress. So the staff of the hotel, I think it's rather funny. They both seem, the manager and the photographer who takes their picture in order to send it to their local newspaper, to give them a slight, celebrity status in their hometown, which they say is, Mrs. Gibbs calls it the Elgin Bugle. Now, I'm sure there's an Elgin in every state in the United States, and probably areas of Europe, there's probably cities with that name, I'm guessing. The only Elgin I know is Elgin, Illinois. So they may or may not be from Illinois. We don't know. And we never do find out. But the Elgin Bugle, a little bit of trivia. If you're ever on Jeopardy and Ken Jennings asks you that question, now you'll know and you'll be able to win. So the Elgin Bugle is the paper. Not that really matters in the scheme of things in this episode, but, just a little something. I used to live not too far from Elgin when I was younger, so it just kind of means a little something, extra to me. No big deal. Not even worth really worrying about, but here we are. But the hotel staff seem both at the same time to be very saccharine and very condescending at the same time, and to me it's laughable. It's funny the way that they sort of act like, they've done this a million times. They don't really care, but they're also trying to seem, genuine and heartfelt and concerning to the needs of the people that aren't paying for the trip, that they're currently occupying the hotel and casino, and look like the kind of people that wouldn't spend a dime in the casino in the first place. They only came because they got the free trip. So there's that little sort of air of haughty derision from the staff, and it always kind of makes me chuckle when I watch this episode. So we get the sense from first meeting him that Franklin Gibbs is a bit of an overbearing fuss budget of a man who's only on the trip because he seems like the kind of guy that if he let his wife out of his sight for more than 5 minutes would lose his noodle and start accosting people. So he pretty much reluctantly goes on this trip because his wife wanted it and she wanted to go. And it's a free trip, and he seems like the kind of guy that likes free things whether he wants to do them or not. And so he comes on the trip with her. So just for fun, as Franklin is planning on taking both of them back up to their hotel room, Mrs. Gibbs plugs a nickel into a slot machine, and in true form and fashion, Mr. Gibbs loses his mind and starts yelling at her in the middle of the casino. Only reluctantly allowing her to pull the lever on the machine since the nickel's already in there. It's already gone. So she pulls the lever. She loses the nickel, obviously. And, Mr. Gibbs has this air of, I told you so. This so thick you could barely see through the fog of it. But then, as Michael Scott would say, how the turntables have turned in a moment of happenstance on the way back to the hotel after the whole nickel fiasco. A drunk man comes up to Mr. Gibbs and starts manhandling him and tells him to take this dollar and put it in this machine and pull the lever because he's had bad luck at the machine and maybe Gibbs can have better luck. And so the guy takes Mr. Gibbs by the hand, puts the silver dollar in his hand, puts it in the machine, and of course Gibbs is very annoyed by this, as most people are when they're assaulted by drunk people. But he winds up actually putting the silver dollar in with the guy's help, and Gibbs pulls the lever, and he winds up winning somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think it's $10, maybe 10 silver dollars fall from the machine. So old Franklin gets a little bit of a twinkle in his eye, but they go back up to the hotel room anyway. Franklin can't sleep because he's thinking about that sweet, sweet dollar money falling out of the machine, and so he tells Flora, his wife, that he can't sleep with the money in the room, so he's got to go back downstairs and put the money back in the machine so that so the money is no longer in their lives, and it's no longer haunting him, and he just can't stand having it in the room, so he's got to get rid of it. So he has to go downstairs and put the money in the machine and get rid of it once for all, because it's horrible money, because it's, the result of gambling and everything else, and it's just horrible money, and they're horrible people for keeping it, and he's got to get rid of it. So by this time, we know that old Franklin's got the bug. We know that he's been bit by the lights and the sounds and the free watered down drinks that you get when you gamble, and the cigar and cigarette girls that used to be running around out there with the stockings with the lines in them, and sounded like Betty Boop and stuff. And here we are. Franklin's addicted, so he's got to go plug them sweet dollars into that one-armed bandit and see what happens. So he gets dressed in a hurry, and he goes downstairs to start plugging away at the machine. This leads to him spending somewhere in the equivalent of about 12 to 18 hours at that machine. Mrs. Gibbs tries several times to get him to leave the machine, which results in a very vocal, very nearly physical argument between Mr. and Mrs. Gibbs, where ultimately Mr. Gibbs knocks over the slot machine to the ground after it takes his last dollar, and the lever malfunctions, and he can't actually play the $1 or the last dollar that he put in there. So he knocks the machine over. The casino people kind of sort of usher them away to go back to their room, and they put an out of order sign on the slot machine, and that's that. They go back to the room. Now, during this 12 to 18 hour gambling extravaganza that Franklin goes on, he also writes several checks spending a lot of money for a couple from Elgin that come out to Vegas to gamble on a free 2-night, 3-day vacation as a result of Mrs. Gibbs being very handy at sweepstakes. So they wind up with less money that they had when they came there, which of course is ultimately any casino's goal of anyone that walks through the front door. But here we are. So they're back at their room, more broke, and Franklin not doing so well. When the last part of the story kicks in, where Franklin hears his name being called in what is a garbled mixture of a person's voice and slot coins falling out of a slot machine into a tray. Franklin opens the hotel door to find the slot machine in the hallway. He closes the door. The door opens. The slot machine starts to come in. Franklin, is very in a panic, in a very heightened state, very manic state, and the machine pursues him through the hotel room. Mrs. Gibbs, of course, seeing her husband freaking the hell out because she can't see the machine, only Franklin can see the machine. So she's just wondering why her husband's, going crazy. She's about to call the doctor or somebody. And Franklin winds up through the machine, pushing him basically, or, hurting him toward it. Winds up falling out the thinnest movie or television prop window that was ever created by man or beast. And he winds up falling out the window to the concrete below, to his death, where we then see, of course, people down there tending to his dead body, with the last shot being the slot machine coming out to the parking lot to basically gloat at what it's done, and it then spits a silver dollar out, which rolls out and over to Franklin's hand and lands on the pavement in the last shot of the episode. And so I will go ahead and do the closing narration at this time, so take it away, me. Mr. Franklin Gibbs, visitor to Las Vegas, who lost his money, his reason, and finally his life to an inanimate metal machine, variously described as the one-armed bandit, a slot machine, or, in Mr. Franklin Gibbs' words, a monster with a will of its own. For our purposes, we'll stick with the latter definition because we're in the Twilight Zone. Alright, so, in the realm of the Twilight Zone, if you're a fan, if you like the series, if you've just started the series, if you've seen it, from start to finish 17 times over the last 40 years, you'll know, or you'll get to know if you don't know yet. There are several such episodes in the Twilight Zone that deal with an inanimate object changing the course of the protagonist's lives throughout the series. There are several episodes. In the episode "A Penny for Your Thoughts," it's a quarter standing on edge that that is the catalyst in the episode. In "The Man in the Bottle," it's a wine bottle that is the catalyst for the couple in the show. In "Nick of Time," William Shatner's superb overacting is the result of a Mystic Seer tabletop little machine that is the catalyst, in that episode. So it's not a new theme for the Twilight Zone, nor is it a one-off, but it's also not a new theme for literature, TV, movies, radio, all media, throughout time, to have an inanimate object play a huge role or to be a catalyst for change in a protagonist or antagonist's life, even. We've seen that even in the scant few episodes that I've done on this podcast. We've seen it a few times. I mean, if you break it down, the entire episode of What You Need that was earlier in this season is basically an entire series of short ideas where an inanimate object is a catalyst for change in the protagonist, or in that case, antagonist's life, ultimately resulting in his demise. So it's not a new concept in the Twilight Zone or in really any other entertainment media of the time or of slightly prior, because you got to remember the Twilight Zone came out right after radio really started to go away. I don't mean go away as in, it doesn't exist, but go away as in people didn't sit around and listen to Suspense or Dimension X or Johnny Dollar or any of the other old-time radio programs. My favorite's The Great Gildersleeve, if you're ever interested in listening to old-time radio programs. I don't know why, I just absolutely love that show. And Suspense is really good. If you're a Twilight Zone fan, you would really like the radio show Suspense from the 30s through the 50s, or it might have ran even into the 60s, I'm not sure. But definitely give it a listen if you like old-time radio programs and murder mysteries and other things like that. It's really a well-done show. But the inanimate object idea, of course, the object always represents or deals with some sort of vice or superstition or something like that. It's always dealing moralistically with something that is a character flaw in one of the characters in the story. And even in this episode, of course, it's addiction. So, it was in specific case, gambling addiction. But in my opinion, this episode is middle to lower tier. Twilight Zone. It's not a horrible episode. It's certainly not the worst by any means. But then the story is okay and the actors are capable, but it just kind of falls flat to me and seems a little too on the nose and preachy for my taste. Now I get it. A story, especially one like this, has to deal in moral issues, and it sort of, in a way, almost has to be preachy, but this just seemed a little too over the top for me, and I've always thought of this episode as, middle to lower tier, and even, just as a side, even Mrs. Gibbs falls prey to the Twilight Zone, no one knew how to write for women at that time sort of thing, because even Mrs. Gibbs, who ultimately winds up, you think in the beginning she's going to be the one that falls prey to the gambling addiction, but it's actually her husband. As she even turns into the voice of reason, they somehow still make her into a very one-dimensional, stereotypically nagging sort of wife, which, sadly, it's a common thing in the Twilight Zone, and not even just the Twilight Zone, but also in pretty much any other show of the era, because the writing room was mostly composed of men, and men didn't really know or really care how to write for women. At the time, it was more just they were trying to tell a story, and women were basically used more for exposition or the damsel in distress sort of trope, instead of actually writing intelligently and confidently for the women in the story. But that's another story. That's another topic for another time. We don't need to delve into sociosexual politics of the 50s and 60s on a podcast about a 60-year-old television show that dealt with monsters from outer space. So while I like this episode, and I say I like it, like I said, it's not my favorite. To me, it's middle tier at best. I don't hate it, but it also doesn't really get repeat viewings in my house. If I were to sit down and it was already on, I would watch it because it's the Twilight Zone, and I love the Twilight Zone, which is why I do what I do, and why I'm doing what I'm doing right now. It's for my love of the show. So I would watch it, but, I would be waiting for the next episode to start, basically. So if you think like I do, great. Drop me a line and tell me so at dimensionstzpodcast@gmail.com. Or if you completely disagree and think I'm a nutcase, let me know about it at dimensionszpodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you either way. So let's move on to the people that comprise this episode. Robert Florey was the director. He also directed Perchance to Dream. So if you want to know about him and his bio, go back and listen to that episode of my podcast, because one, it's a better episode of The Twilight Zone, and two, you can hear his bio if you're interested. Now, the character of Franklin Gibbs was played by Everett Sloane, who was born in 1909 and died in 1965. So if you're keeping track, he dies about 5 years after this episode airs, about 5.5 years after this episode airs. He has 115 IMDb credits to his name. When he was a younger man, he was a runner on Wall Street for the stock market, and after the crash in 29, he decided to take up acting. where he started acting in radio and then eventually to Broadway, where in between the time he got signed on to be part of Orson Welles' Mercury Theater, which, if you know anything about old-time radio or Orson Welles, he was quite the popular fella back in the day, and was definitely talented. And his radio plays were among some of the best, in the business. He did the War of the Worlds podcast. Ha 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 ha. I'm a moron. He did the War of the Worlds radio program that caused such a ruckus at the time that it was aired, because there was a certain pocket of the population that listened to it that actually thought it was a real thing going on. But that's a whole nother thing. You should look it up if you're interested in that. It's quite a story, and if you want to, give that radio broadcast a listen, because it's very well done, and quite an interesting piece of American radio history. So, being in Orson Welles' Mercury Radio Theater, Mr. Sloan was actually got the part of, or I should say, Orson Welles cast him as Mr. Berenstein. Not Berenstain, for any Mandela Effect listeners out there. Not Berenstain, but Berenstein in Citizen Kane, which, if you know anything about old movies or cinema, that's quite a big deal as well. So Orson Welles was knocking it out of the park back then, with that sort of thing. He also appeared in Rod Serling's television adapted play Patterns, in which he got nominated for an Emmy. He was also in several movies and TV shows, such as The Disorderly Orderly with Jerry Lewis, as well as, of course, like everyone else in the time, he did episodes of Rawhide, Wagon Train, Gunsmoke, Dick Tracy, Petticoat Junction, lots of things, and he was also Jubal Foster in an episode of the Andy Griffith Show. So if you're an Andy Griffith Show fan, Jubal Foster, you would remember that episode as being the Eggman who was having to sell his land to the county so that they could put a road through his property, and spoiler alert, he was actually making moonshine in his chicken coop. So, great episode of the Andy Griffith Show. If you've never seen it, give it a look. Great early American television, great television series. So just, give it a look. But he was Jubal Foster in that episode. Sadly, as a result of glaucoma, Mr. Sloan was starting to go blind, or at least he perceived he was starting to go blind, which he was losing his sight, obviously, from glaucoma, but due to this, he decided to overdose on barbiturates and take his own life in 1965. So, again, much as in previous episodes that I've mentioned this, mental health is no joke. If you're having issues, please seek help. By all means, your mental health is important, and please take care of yourself out there. But sadly, he died, by his own hand in 1965. Now, Flora Gibbs was played by Vivi Janis, who was born in 1911 and died in 1988. She had 89 credits on her IMDb. She was a character actress from television who appeared in many different series and episodes of things like Death Valley Days, I Love Lucy, George Burns and Gracie Allen Show, Dragnet, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Father Knows Best. She was in 2 episodes of The Twilight Zone. She was in this episode and Man in the Bottle, which I actually spoke about earlier in one of the about being one of the episodes that deals with an inanimate object being a catalyst for the protagonist's lives. And she ended her career with a role in the show called The Young Landlords in 1983, and then of course she died 5 years later. She was married to Robert Cummings in 1935 to 1943, who was a somewhat famous actor back in the day, and she was also married to Mr. John Larch from 1955 to her death in 1988. And of course, we've already talked about Mr. Larch, who was the psychiatrist in the episode Perchance to Dream that we covered earlier in this podcast, or earlier in this season of this podcast. So if you want to give that a listen, as I said before, that's a great episode, and I recommend, of course, listening to my own podcast and that podcast episode of my podcast. And I'll say podcast one more time because I haven't said it enough in the last 2 sentences. And of course, we'll see Mr. Larch again in the episode Dust, which is going to be a long one when we get to it, and in the episode It's a Good Life, one of the most famous, most well-loved episodes of the series, where he plays the father to the titular character played by Bill Mumy of Anthony Fremont. So when we get to that, we'll also hear about Mr. Larch again. But, of course, this is not about him. This is about Vivi Janice. So she was a fantastic character actress who died in 1988. Now, let's move on to the trivia section of the podcast. This episode was based on an actual experience by Rod Serling. Upon signing the deal for the Twilight Zone, he took his wife to Vegas so that they could celebrate, this milestone in his career. He just got a big TV deal, which, of course, neither one of them knew how far-reaching that deal would ultimately wind up being in the annals of television and even pop culture history in this country. So I'm glad they celebrated. Definitely, they should have celebrated more given the impact that this show had on everything from pop culture to future writers, directors, stories, movies, and everything else that came from this and from the mind of Mr. Serling. But he and his wife went to Vegas to celebrate after he signed the deal for the Twilight Zone, and Rod actually had quite some dealing with a one-armed bandit while he was in Vegas, which led to him penning this episode of the Twilight Zone. So it's actually sort of based on a true story, except Rod didn't get stalked by a sentient slot machine and fall out the thinnest window in history that was ever created by beast or man on a movie or television show. So that's a little something. While it was set in Las Vegas, it was actually filmed in Los Angeles. And at that time, and I think it may still be today, slot machines were illegal in the state of California. So they had to basically get special permission from the LAPD to be able to use slot machines on the set. And the slot machines that they used were actually slot machines that were confiscated by the LAPD. And throughout the entire filming of the episode, they had a couple of cops on set the entire time to make sure that none of the slot machines disappeared, and went missing. So that's a little something. The infamous slot machine that kills Franklin Gibbs will also be seen again in Season 2's episode The Prime Mover, starring Buddy Ebsen, which we will get to. And lastly, while the name of the hotel and casino is never actually given, it's supposedly supposed to take place at the Dunes, which was in operation from 1955 to, I think, 1995 when they tore it down. And so let's move on to the mistakes and goofs of the episode. When Franklin falls out the absolutely paper-thin window, worst on-set window ever created by man or beast for a television or movie program, his legs and feet basically stop and go to the right when he falls out the window, which means he basically only fell about 6 or 8 inches instead of falling all the way to his death, because obviously it's a set and they're not actually going to have somebody fall out of a 4-story window. That wasn't a thing that was done in television shows at the time. So we get Franklin Gibbs falling out about 6 to 8 inches out of a window, where we see his feet go to the right, and he falls to his death ultimately. But it was just a few inches. And then, of course, when Mrs. Gibbs looks out the window and she sees her husband lying on the pavement, and he's surrounded by glass from falling out of the most paper-thin, ridiculously made, not fit to be made by man or beast for any television show or movie, paper-thin window. When the machine comes outside and rolls the silver dollar over to his hand, he is surrounded by glass in the long shot, but in the up close shot, when the the silver dollar goes to his hand, there is not a piece of glass to be seen in sight. So just a slight continuity error on the backs of the production staff on that one. No biggie, but we're going to mention it here anyway. Just that's what we do. Now, likes and dislikes. I like the story. I like the idea of the inanimate object basically becoming sentient or coming to life, whether by actually coming to life or just in the mind of the person who it's coming after. I always like those stories of objects becoming catalysts for change for the protagonist. I always like those stories, and I'll continue to always like those stories. And that's part of the reason why I like a lot of the Twilight Zone episodes that are like that. This one is a little weaker than some, but it is what it is. The acting was good. I thought that Everett Sloane and Vivi Janis did wonderfully in their parts. They were quite well together and separately. But to me, the pacing of the episode was kind of off, and the end result of Franklin basically being pushed or assailed out the most ridiculously paper thin window that was ever made by man or beast for a radio, movie, or television program ever created. I felt could have been done a little differently or a little better. I understood the idea, but I would almost have wished that the machine actually pushed him out the window in front of, Mrs. Gibbs, so Mrs. Gibbs could actually see the machine was doing it, and not just Franklin going nuts. And then, of course, the whole aftermath of no one believing her that a machine pushed her husband out the window. I thought that would be, who knows? Who knows? That's why I'm not a writer. You know what I mean? But I don't know. To me, the story was kind of, it could have been done better, in my opinion. So let's move on to casting today. If Hollywood were to call me and say, "Hey, Bill, this is Hollywood, and we're going to remake this episode of The Twilight Zone. We know you love it. Who would you cast in the characters of the people in this episode of The Twilight Zone?" And I would say, well, Hollywood, here's who I would cast in this episode. For Franklin Gibbs, I would go with the ever lovely, ever talented, ever awesome Bob Odenkirk as Franklin Gibbs. And for Flora Gibbs, I would go with Frances McDormand. I think she'd be wonderful at it, and I think if they gave her a little more to do, it would definitely round the story out a little better. And then, of course, knowing me, you have to have a big actor in a small role, or a big character in a small role. For the role of the drunk that accosts Mr. Gibbs and gives him the silver dollar and starts the whole process of the gambling addiction, let's throw Bob Newhart into that mix. I'd love to see Bob Newhart playing drunk and accosting Bob Odenkirk. I think that would be quite something to see on the screen, and it would really, really be awesome. And that's really about all the characters there were. I mean, bit characters aside, I think Bob Odenkirk and Frances McDormand, with the help of the ever lovely and ever great Bob Newhart, would totally sell the episode, and it wouldn't be a mid-tier to lower tier Twilight Zone episode in my mind as it currently sits. And maybe, just maybe, if they updated it and put Bob Odenkirk and Frances McDormand and Bob Newhart in this episode, maybe they could have something other than a extremely, extremely poor, paper-thin window for Bob Odenkirk that was ever created by man or beast for a radio, television, or movie episode to fall out of. Now, on to the moral and philosophy of this episode. I think it's quite ham-fisted and heavy-handed, but we know that this episode deals with addiction. In this episode specifically, gambling addiction, but of course that could be carried over into literally any addiction of any kind, be it drug, alcohol, sex, rock and roll, Pokemon, you name it. Any addiction can be an addiction. Anything can be an addiction, which is, why, again, the whole everything in moderation saying always comes to mind. And of course, self-control, which is something that a lot of people struggle with, and that's how addictions usually form, or at least in my armchair psychiatrist's opinion. And of course, you can't always control self-control, and things like addictions for drugs, alcohol, that sort of thing, they are a sickness. It's not just a person lacking the ability to control themselves. So we finally figured out that it's not just people being weak, it's people that legitimately have a problem and need help. And if you know anyone like that in your life, please help them to get the help they need, because they are actually sick people and they need all the help they can get. And if you do have anyone that's struggling with any sort of addiction, please try to get help for them. There's help available, and I encourage you to seek help yourself if you have any sort of issues like that as well. I know seeking help can be a hard thing, but you should do it, and it's a good thing. So, Rod was trying to warn us in this episode about addiction, slightly based on a true story from his own experience. So, that's a little something. So, that's quite interesting. So, there you go. So, let's move on to listener feedback. I got an email from a man called Steve who said, I just started listening to the podcast last week and I'm enjoying it. I'm a huge Twilight Zone fan. Keep plugging away at it. Goes on to tell me some more nice things and encourages me to keep going with the show, which I'm definitely doing. And he has his own podcast as well, and I listen to his, and I tell you, I really like it. It is his podcast is called Retro Media Talk, which he and his guests talk about television shows, movies, music, and everything from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So if you are a child of that time, or if you are if you grew up watching movies, television shows, music from the 70s, 80s, 90s, or if you love, I guess it would be termed nostalgia nowadays from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, give their show a listen. It's quite nice. It's quite well done, and it's very funny, very informative, and it's called Retro Media Talk. So give them a listen. We're all in this together, and they put on a very good show over there. So give them a listen. That's pretty much all the listener feedback I have for this week. But if you'd like to drop me a line and talk about previous episodes, future episodes, whatever you want to talk about related to the Twilight Zone, please drop me a line at dimensionszpodcast@gmail.com. That's DIMENSIONS TZ podcast PODCAST @gmail.com, and I look forward to hearing from you. So the clock on the wall says it's time for me to go, but thank you for being with me, and stay tuned for next week's episode, where we will be discussing Season 1, Episode 18, where a man tries to run from his past problems and winds up in the future. So join us for next week's episode entitled The Last Flight. Thank you for listening, and have a good night.